Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung to our special series at the Jerusalem International Writers Festival on the power of responsibility. It is a great pleasure and privilege to us to have been involved in the Jerusalem International Writers Festival here at the Mishkanosha Ananim from its very beginning in 2008. As a political foundation, our aim is to create a platform for dialogue and discussion. Literature is not created in a vacuum. In one way or the other, it will always reflect a reality in which it has been created. That is why it is so important for us to host panel discussions of social-political orientation, examining the power of literature to influence social and political changes of local and global significance. Just a couple of words about the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. We are a German political foundation with the vision to promote international dialogue, sustainable development, good governance, capacity building, regional integration, and enhance understanding of the key drivers of global developments. We are named after the first Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, Konrad Adenauer. His name represents the democratic rebuilding of Germany, reconciliation with France, the anchoring of German foreign policy in a transatlantic community of values, the establishment of the unique relationship between Israel and Germany as well as with the European Union, and of course the vision of European unity and Germany's orientation towards a social market economy. In its mission statement, the KAS commits itself to preserving and developing the close friendship between Israel and Germany. Therefore, KAS Israel mainly works on deepening the relations between both countries and between Israel and the EU in the field of foreign and security policy as well as social and economic policy by emphasizing the common interests. We have an international network of a little bit more than 100 offices worldwide, and this year our office in Israel celebrates its 40th anniversary of activities. Israel is perhaps the most suitable place to examine the idea that we set as a motto for this year's series, the power of responsibility. Politics is part of everyday life and thus finds its way to art and literature. There is no doubt that literature is meant first and foremost to fill our spirits and minds with interest and joy. However, the question, what is the role and the responsibility of writers and thinkers towards their communities as well as towards global reality, especially in times of political crises we are facing now, is inevitable. This is exactly what our unique events at the Writers' Festival will try to achieve, featuring a dialogue between great writers and thinkers of our time, whom I thank sincerely for their participation. And let me also thank the Mishkanosha Ananim and its wonderful team very cordially. It is a privilege to cooperate with such an outstanding partner. I wish you all a fruitful and meaningful discussion. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to the 10th Jerusalem Writers Festival in Mishkanosha Ananim. This event is part of the special series on the power of responsibility, which was organized in collaboration with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Israel and is dedicated to examining the relationships between power, state, economy, and climate in the 21st century. Let me introduce our speakers today. Ms. Oksana Zabushko. Dr. Zabushko is a leading contemporary Ukrainian writer and intellectual, author of more than 20 books of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, which have been translated into 17 languages. Her first novel, Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex, was one of the first feminist novels in modern Ukrainian literature, the first Ukrainian bestseller, and made her internationally famous. This book is also going to be published in Hebrew translation later this year. She lectured in the USA on Ukrainian literature and culture, including at Harvard University. She is a doctor of philosophy. Among her awards are the Antonovich Prize for Literary Works Written in Ukrainian and for Research in Ukrainian Studies from 2009, a Polish International Angelus Central European Literature Award from 2013, the Shevchenko National Prize, the highest state prize of Ukraine for works of culture and arts in 2019, and the Women in Arts Award for Female Achievement in Ukrainian Art 2020. Our next speaker is Shalom Boguslavsky. Shalom is a USSR-born Israeli political blogger, instructor, and tour guide in both Jerusalem and Eastern Europe. His work combines tourism with intellectual debate and social involvement. Shalom was one of the founders of the groups Generation 1.5 and the Cultural Brigade, composed of young Russian speakers in Israel. There, he led social and cultural projects for combating racism and discrimination and promoting the culture of former Soviet Union immigrants as part of the Israeli multicultural mosaic. He has been a leading commentator on the current Russian war in Ukraine and is working on a book, A Popular History of Jews in Ukraine. And I will introduce myself. My name is Asaf Baltov. I'm an Israeli interested in Ukrainian literature, and I'm the founding editor of the Nemala series of translations from Ukrainian literature. So far, 2 novels have been published by 9 Lives Press. The first is Moscoviad by Yuri Andruchovich, and the second is Tango of Death by Yuri Vinnichuk. The next book in the series, to be published later this year, is the influential book titled Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex by Dr. Zabushko, our guest today. So to start off, I would like to address the question of the image of Ukraine, the perception of Ukraine in the minds of most Israelis who don't have a particular familiarity with the region. And it seems to me that to most such Israelis, Ukraine stands for only 3 or 4 things, all from an exclusively Jewish lens. Jewish shtetls, pogroms by Cossacks, Nazi collaborators, and Hasidism and Rabbi Nachman of Uman. Almost nothing is known of Ukraine's own history and culture beyond that. These days, alongside a lot of sympathy for Ukraine and material humanitarian aid to Ukrainian refugees here in Israel and in Europe, there are still some Israeli voices absurdly asserting all Ukrainians are anti-Semites, or they deserve everything for what they have done during the Holocaust, etc. What do Israelis most urgently need to understand about Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, and Ukrainian identity? And what role might literature play in fostering such understanding? I would like to hear your thoughts, Shalom, and then we'll move on to Ms. Zabushko.
Since we're talking about exclusive Jewish lands, I will start from that. The thing is, it is impossible, or it doesn't make sense to understand Jewish history without understanding Ukrainian history. And I'm not talking only about Ukrainian Jewish history, but Jewish history in general. The thing is, Ukraine is not another place where Jews lived. This used to be the most Jewish country on earth. If to be more exact, it's the right bank of the Dnipro. It's Western Ukraine, along with Eastern Poland and Southern Belarus, but mostly in Ukraine of today. This was the most Jewish place ever. So the rules of the game for Jews there being quite different. And since we're talking about, depends on the time, on the period, but easily we can say half of the Jews of the world are from Ukraine originally, even more than that. So looking at the Jewish history of Ukraine through foreign lens, it's absurd because the situation is in Ukraine wasn't like in, say, Germany, when you have tiny Jewish minority inside more or less, let's say, homogeneous or hegemonic group. We're talking about quite big, even relative numbers, and quite, I would say, powerful. Jewish group in a multinational, multicultural, and multi-religious environment. So it's not one kind of big hegemonic culture that treats a tiny minority in this or that way, but more like a group which is a participant in a very complicated game with a lot of players, which most of history actually hate each other, of course, but sometimes they cooperate and work together. So it's very complicated history and complicated political history, I would say, that if you explore only Jewish history without understanding the political, cultural, historical context, you don't understand why those things happened. So for me, not knowing Ukraine and Eastern Europe in general, because if we're talking about Eastern Europe, it's not more than half of the Jews in the world, it's at least 80% of the Jews in the world, it doesn't make sense not knowing the history of Ukraine. So I don't see them as separate at all, okay? Ukrainian history is part of my heritage as a Jew. I think Jewish history in Ukraine is supposed to be part of Ukrainian history. And I think the one thing that Israelis should understand is that we need to know this place as itself, as a unit to be discussed, not part of Russia or part of Soviet Union or part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or part of Hasidic or Jewish history or anti-Semitism, whatever. We need to know something about this country and its people and its history.
Thank you very much. Dr. Zabushko.
Well, please address me, Oksana. Dr. Zabushko sounds very ceremonial and very demanding too. While actually I'm not going, to have any academic presentation because what you just listed in your question sounds to my Ukrainian ear. Well, like Shalom gave, the Jewish prospect of the issue, and my turn is to give a Ukrainian one, and to me it sounds like a list of the negative stereotypes, which actually some 30 years ago. That is after the collapse of the Soviet Union and after we started to travel and after we become a part of a cultural exchange with the West, took me as a total surprise. Well, as a USSR born, as you have this description, but not only USSR born, but as a Soviet Ukraine born youth, I owe a lot to the atmosphere of this Soviet 70s, to this dissident friendship between the so-called Ukrainian nationalists and Zionists. Zionists were all my Jewish friends and all my parents' Jewish friends who were then very proud with the Israeli state and who were heading to Israel and who wanted to emigrate from the USSR. And the Ukrainian part, the so-called Ukrainian bourgeois nationalists, well, these were Ukrainian intelligentsia, Ukrainian intellectuals who were stubborn at supporting their Ukrainian identity, which was politically undesirable issue according, to the Soviet ideological standards of the time. And this Jewish-Ukrainian friendship and Jewish-Ukrainian community, so to speak, I mean, it's been the constant subject of, well, actually political hate in the Soviet propaganda of the time. As you know, that this was the subject of the constant jokes, the subject of the political jokes in this milieu that was shaping me and that was shaping, you know, my world outlook. So for me, it was like, you know, kind of natural for yours and our freedom. And more than that, the Jewish culture, the repressed Jewish culture, that which was purged under Stalin, that which used to belong for centuries prior to the Stalinist times to the Ukrainian cultural landscape. Shalom has said that mostly it was hatred. I disagree with that. I mean, hatred is something which is easily, so to speak, which is a very easy, an easy subject for the political technologies of hatred mongering. So it's easy to nail these pages in the history of two people that were very close and very intertwined in their historical contacts, in their actually, well, I don't know, neighborhood, you know, and yes, you know, my mother was born in one of these, okay, you say shtetl, yes, well, like one of these stereotypes. But I do know something about this shtetl culture from the Ukrainian part. And my mom was born in one of these, well, old, ancient, you know, Ukrainian towns in central Ukraine, which were kind of typical, like two Orthodox churches, one Polish kostol, one synagogue, and some, well, and Jewish community, quite a large Jewish community. So I know some Yiddish words from my grandmother, who was using them not because she was Jewish, she was Ukrainian, but because that was part, you know, of her everyday life with her neighbors, friends, and everything. And she used to address me like when I was behaving like a bad girl, and when I was capricious or something like this. Oh, look at this Michigan. So that was the kind of and there were like dozen of words like this. So this was a usual façon de parler, manner of talking, you know, in Ukrainian families of this area. And yes, all this joke, popular culture, you know, all this Shalom Aleichem atmosphere, you know, that's something which is, I don't know, which is very close to me and which is in a way a part of my culture. And these were not the malicious jokes. These were not jokes of hatred. These were jokes which were partly which make in the Ukrainian literature of the 19th century, in Stepan Rudansky verses. So for me, it is like the problem is that the culture of the Ukrainian Jewry has been destroyed before Shoah, before Holocaust. In fact, it has been destroyed with 3 waves of depression. First, under Stalin in the 30s. Second, Shoah, Holocaust. And then in the 70s, Aliyah, when people were just living. people who were still speaking, people in my parents' generation, who were bilingual, speaking Yiddish and Ukrainian as their native languages. And I still remember my generation is probably the last one who still has this music, this intonation of this Yiddish-speaking Ukrainian Jews for whom Ukrainian was their native language. And that's something which I think can be and should be traced in the Jewish culture nowadays, because yes, I do hear, you know, this resonating reverberations of the Ukrainian influence, well, even in Paul Celan's poetry, which are mostly invisible for those who does not have a clue about Ukrainian culture and has absolutely no idea where this or that thing might come from. And yes, you have to know both. You have to belong somehow, well, to play both pianos, to know both of these cultures, to be able to appreciate these deep contacts and these deep interconnections. If there is a big, great lacune, then you have political technologies. And ignorance always makes a good soil for all the toxic things springing out. And then a great deal of these stereotypes you've listed, well, yes, yes, it deserves being revised in itself. It deserves a closer examination, it deserves investigations, it deserves studies, but studies with the new optics. And that's something, that's the work which is still ahead of us, and the work which we should do on both sides simultaneously. And well, I really appreciate you raising this subject in this way and in this talk.
Thank you very much. And yes, we certainly view our literary work as contributing to that. I mean, first and foremost, it's fine literature that we are offering, but we also hope it'll be a contribution to this revisited and improved discourse about Ukrainian history, including the Jewish-Ukrainian shared history. And to bring us to the present, I would like to follow up with you, Oksana, and address the current context. Today's Russian war against Ukraine was intended as a blitzkrieg, toppling of the Ukrainian government and the installation of a Kremlin puppet in its stead. It failed completely and backfired severely on Russia, to Putin's great surprise and frustration. In an interview I gave not so long ago, I suggested that had Putin read Ukrainian literature, he would not have been surprised and would not have so gravely misjudged the Ukrainian people. What are your thoughts on the role literature has and could have on combating the traditional imperialist view of Ukraine as simultaneously a brother nation, and also, forgive me, the half-wit cousin, the backwater of the glorious Russian culture. That really should just assimilate completely into the Russian nation.
Putin's backyard, you know, I've been coming across this expression only too often in the past, I would say 2 or 3 months before the invasion. So it really pisses me off by now. But you know, the problem with imperialism, to answer your question as briefly as I can, is that imperialism is very monological. Imperialism does not read the literature, is not interested in the literature or culture of the conquered part. No way. It's always a one-way road. Wait a second, I think it was a Yiddish author, Jacob Gladstein, who has this beautiful formula when once asked what is the difference between major and minor literature. Yiddish obviously was considered to be a minor literature. Answered that the difference is that I have to read T.S. Eliot, but T.S. Eliot doesn't have to read me. So that's, I would say, the exhaustive formula of imperialism in culture. And your suggestion that if Putin were reading Ukrainian literature, he would have been better prepared. I mean, if Putin were reading Ukrainian literature, he wouldn't have been Putin in the first place. So that's the whole problem. It's the problem of monologue versus dialogue. It's the problem of, and in the Russian version of imperialism, it's like exclusion of any chance for multiculturalism. It is a very homogeneous culture, so to speak, where aimed at devouring, digesting, destroying what it cannot assimilate and claim as its property, and just using all the rest, like you hear about to illustrate this by one of these negative stereotypes about Ukrainians you've mentioned at the beginning. Of course, when you have, let us say, a Nazi collaborator from the World War II, you will always have a note that he was Ukrainian, even though it was just the matter of his ethnic background. I mean, we can't discuss an issue of collective responsibility because Ukraine was not an actor in that horrible drama then, and there was no Ukrainian statehood, and there were no representatives, no chosen representatives, no elected representatives of the legitimate representatives of the Ukrainian people. But Nazi collaborator, yes, you always know that he is Ukrainian if he was. How many people know that Sergei Korolev, the father of the Soviet space industry and the father of all this glamorous chapter in Soviet history, space flights, Yuri Gagarin and everything. So the great constructor, the great avia constructor, the constructor of the first Soviet space rockets, Sergei Korolev, he was Ukrainian, and he was very much he was Ukrainian not only because that was his his official something that was put in the Soviet passports, but that was his background. That's how he was raised, and he was asking the other Ukrainian cosmonaut Popovich to sing in the space. For him, his favorite Ukrainian song, "Дивлюсь на небо," and was very happy, when it sounded in the outer space. And then actually not only Korolev, but also most of these fathers of the Soviet space industry, yes, they were Ukrainians. No, this is never mentioned. They are either great Soviet constructors or Russians, because everything Soviet is Russian by definition. Everything what is good is Russian. Everything what is bad is Russian, is Ukrainian. So that's very typical Russian way of appropriating the subjugated cultures, the very typical way of how Russian colonialism takes this subordinate, subaltern cultures and how they are treated or mistreated. And Ukraine is one of the most notorious examples, I would say, because I have to make this point that yes, our relations with the Russians is kind of special, even as compared to all the other former Soviet nations or the former nations of the former Soviet blocs, because let's not forget that Putin is not going to stop at the border of the former USSR. He has already claimed the former, claimed back the former Soviet bloc. So NATO back to the border of 1997, that was a very clear ambition to get back the former Soviet, the former Warsaw Pact countries. Ours, I mean, Ukrainian relations, yes, they are special because in fact, it is Ukraine that has provided, it is our forefathers from the 16th and 17th centuries, the Kiev Mohyla intellectuals who has created, plotted the concept of this Orthodox empire, and who has provided the Muscovy of the time with this European Eastern Christian faith. So Teofan Prokopovich, the rector of the Kiev Mohyla Academy, was the major counselor and ideologist for Peter I. Gogol was actually the final, I would say, great mind closing this parade of 2 centuries of our little Russian intellectuals who were civilizing Moscow in a hope to make a multicultural empire in which Kiev will be second Jerusalem. I'm sure you know this theory. Yes, so Kiev will be the second Jerusalem, and our northern colonies, so to speak, the spiritual core is Kiev, and all these northern colonies of Muscovy, of Great Russia, according to the old Greek scheme, yeah. So all that was military power, and our mission was to civilize them, to educate them.
Yes, a quick language note for our listeners. Little Russians is a name for Ukrainians. It's a historic appellation for Ukraine. Yes, used to be a historic appellation for Ukraine.
It comes from this, Greek original, when the core, the metropolis actually is called Little Greece, and the colonies are Great Greece. Yes.
Yes. Touching on Putin's intentions that you mentioned, I want to direct a question to both of you about the West's difficulty in understanding Russia. In your opinion, and we'll start with you, Shalom, why is the West, including Israel, so reluctant to believe Putin's stated imperial aspirations? Why is it so hard to believe the war crimes being committed in Ukraine? And to you, Oksana, I will also ask whether you can see a connection to literature, especially Russian literature, in this reluctance. Shalom.
First of all, I'm not sure that Israel is an integral part of the West. I think that a big difference, and this is something that as Israelis and as Jews we can understand, is long historical memory or its absence. Now, I live in Jerusalem, which is, I guess, the first Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, the thing of, no, this and that happened 800 years ago, and I still resent it, resent you for that, or remember that, or it's still relevant, or to explain things in Jerusalem, I need to go back hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. That's one of the things that made Ukraine very familiar for me and Eastern Europe in general, because I think that Eastern Europe has a long memory as well. By the way, the hatred that we talked about is not the stereotypical one. It's the same one that I see here in Jerusalem, which is very, extremely conflictual and multicultural, and we do hate each other, but we live together and have plenty of cultural exchange. So this is the way that historical memory works. Now, the thing is that in the West, especially in the United States, which basically doesn't have any history, okay, or almost none, compared to other parts of the world, for them, like 18th century is ancient history, okay? Mm-hmm. And for us, both in Jerusalem and Eastern Europe, 18th century is yesterday, afternoon, something like that. So if you think about history as something that starts, maybe with Napoleon or in the First World War, or more commonly in the fall of the Soviet Union, it's very easy to go to this absurd ideas that all of this is because, Putin is worried about the expansion of NATO eastwards or whatever. But as I see it, the reason why the West doesn't understand Russia specifically and the former Russian Empire is that the West is very deeply, I would say, modernized, and Russia is not. And the political debate, as I see it, in former Soviet Union, you see it in Ukraine and Belarus, and in one way or another in Russia itself, is not the debate of the 21st century or even the 20th century between left wing and right wing and socialism, capitalism. This is the discourse of 1848, is empire versus nation state. Mm-hmm. And on the side of the nation state, you have together secular and religious and fascists and leftists and anarchists and priests and whatever. And people in the West cannot understand how can a fascist and an anarcho-feminist stand together on Maidan, waving the Ukrainian flag and singing the Ukrainian anthem. It doesn't fit into the framework of Western, very contemporary modern politics. But it does make a perfect sense in the context of a long historical memory and background and things that are still not solved. Okay, the fact that we're talking right now about the Mohila Academy in Kiev and its relevance to today, and it is relevant. And the thing is, I think that many people, and you don't have to be a big intellectual to know, to understand, and mostly to feel the relevance of that. And I think those feelings and those understanding are alien for Western Europe and surely for the United States of America.
Thank you. Oksana, please.
I agree with Shalom, but only partly. I would not juxtapose here American and Eastern European concept of cultural memory or historical memory for that matter, but American and European altogether, because Western Europe does have its historical and cultural memory quite long, especially when it comes to the political elites of Western European countries. The political elite engraved as successor of the legacy of the same Russian Tsars. Ukraine has no state nor political tradition important enough for the Western elites, so they are actually prepared. They were prepared to buy whatever Putin had to say about these newly born countries, newly born nations, which actually they did agree to consider as belonging to the sphere of Russia's traditional historical interest. And that's part of the problem. But I would say that there is something else behind the scene, namely the image of Russian culture, the beauty culture, this European face of Russian culture, and when they speak about Russian culture, of course, they start with the 19th century, with this golden age of the Russian novel, with Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Chekhov. Again, no one mentions that Chekhov was actually, whose Ukrainian background is never mentioned, and I never ever come through a single Russian Chekhov study ever published in the West that have explored how Chekhov's Ukrainian background has influenced his writings and how it is connected with his singularity in Russian literature of the time, of the past turn of the century. But this the appeal of the Russian literature of the 19th and then of the 20th century has somehow been serving, I would say, as a coverage for Russian imperialism. And that's the big problem which we now have to face. Russian literature never actually managed to produce any clear anti-colonial voice, either in the 19th or in the 20th century, with the exception of Vladimir Grossman, who is one of my favorites and actually never celebrated in Russia after Perestroika. That was a very brief period when Life and Fate was published, and since then he never actually got a place in a Russian cultural pantheon that he deserved. So with the exception of Vasily, oh goodness, what I said, Vasily Grossman. So with the exception of Vasily Grossman, I would say there is, you won't find any anti-colonial statements, anti-colonial approaches in Russian literature, which makes it, with this regard, very different from the other literatures of the former empires, from the other literatures that have imperial traditions behind them. And what struck me in this war, and let me remind that for Ukraine, this war did not start on February 24, but 8 years earlier, that is in 2014, we've been at war for all these 8 years. And this is one of these, missed or unnoticed or half-noticed wars that the West only now comes to recognize. Somewhere, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, I was kind of struck with the statement coming from one of Russian luminaries who, for some reasons, is regarded as liberal, oppositional, well, anti-Putin. It's very easy to be dubbed liberal or oppositional in contemporary Russia. It's enough to say something not quite flattering about Putin, and then to be welcomed by the Western media as oppositional, liberal. They not only that was not only the aggression that they missed. Actually, they've missed Russia being turned into a totalitarian state very quickly, into a police state, into an authoritarian state, into a neo-Orwellian version of totalitarianism, which into the Nazi Germany or even Stalinist Russia of the past century. So the statement that struck me was that when asked why this so-called Moscow liberal was not breathing a word about the annexation of Crimea, the violation of Russian aggression in Donbass, I mean, why keep silence? He had it quite clearly and honestly. I like a fair game. He said, we can't afford to lose a 40 million people market. Well, that was cynical, but that was fair said. A 40 million people market was Ukraine. That was making 40% of the Russian book market. So, in fact, it means that you, a great Russian, author, publisher, intellectual, whatever, doesn't matter, nomination to Dios. You actually are a beneficiary of the imperialist policies of your own state. And yes, you get, so it is like, it is like being an accomplice in this dirty game played by Kremlin, where you can have your niche in which you are allowed to look decent for the West, to play this European, humanistic, nice, appealing face of Russian culture, atrocities and crimes against humanities that came as a total surprise after the Bucha massacre. And it does have something to do with the responsibility of Russian writers and Russian intellectuals, of the contemporary Russian culture, and something that calls for a new Thomas Mann, who back in the 30s did have an intellectual courage to review the German culture and the whole German tradition from the point of this historical responsibility. Because, well, how else? I mean, culture is a part, culture is the way the society communicates with itself in time and space. If you see this society as something struck with a total madness, well, then it's time to talk about the share of culture and the share of the cultural elites, and about the hypocrisy of the cultural elites that have been trying for decades and for ages before to distance themselves from the Russian authorities and to produce, this alleged antagonism. Kremlin is one thing, Russian authorities is one thing, and Russian culture is something else, something totally different, and it's in the opposition towards the power. No, it is not. No, it is not. It is, and it used to be a beneficiary of empire.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these edifying remarks about the complicity of Russian literature and its status as an exportable good of Russian imperialism. I want to bring us back to closer to literature and zoom in a bit to an element in your book, the fieldwork in Ukrainian sex. In your book, the narrator visits Israel as part of a delegation of writers. And although it's a minor episode in the book, it is naturally interesting for Israeli readers. The narrator expresses admiration and perhaps even more envy of the Israeli soldiers, Sabras, born in independent Israel, compared to her own compatriots, broken by the Soviet Union they only recently emerged from. And she also draws an analogy from oppressed Ukrainians to pre-Holocaust European Jews, and I quote, millions of Ashkenazi Jews who had to run the tightrope, merely survive rather than live, sinking deeper and deeper into their chest cavities with each generation. And then the tightrope snapped and everything came crashing down. End quote from English translation of your book. What is the significance for you of this analogy to the Jewish people's own struggle for independence and its successful culmination in the founding of the State of Israel? And decades after writing this book, do you still find this analogy inspiring?
Well, you know, it is, I was not alone with that. I'm a part of the tradition which unfortunately remains invisible to the Israeli audience. But yes, it started with this with the Ukrainian literature of the late 19th century, with Ivan Franko and his big poem Moses that he wrote after his meetings and conversations with Theodor Herzl, who really impressed him a lot, and he left memoirs about this meeting, and he was absolutely fascinated with the guy. So that was like, you know, this paradigm of comparison, you know, how Jews were working. Then with Lesia Ukrainka, there are these parallels and there are these analogies, and she was very much formed, you know, of the ancient Jewish plots and themes, and she has actually a couple of dramas that should be translated into Hebrew and brought to the Israeli theatrical stage, because it's a good stuff, really good stuff, and it's a kind of a universal, you know, Jewish history, ancient Jewish history, being used as a universal language, as a universal metaphor for the nation building of the modern period of the early 20th century and the end of Belle Epoque time. So that's another, please interrupt me because I'm going to lecture on this into infinity. So in a way, you know, this episode, thank you very much for reminding it to me. I recall it. So that's, it has, you know, this kind of heroines, traumatized erotical approach, because she thinks, she ruminates on the issue of beauty, of how this degradation. Yeah, okay. I recall now the original, and yes, how living in a slavery produces physical degradation in generations. Yes, and it's a very interesting issue, by the way. I mean, I really. I'd really like to, maybe one day I'll do a special essay on it or something, but it's interesting. I've been following how the crowd in the streets of Kiev has been changing within these 30 years of independence, how ugly we were a transformation on a massive scale. And that's amazing, you know, it is like, it has something to do, I mean, that's a very special issue, you know, how freedom reforms and transforms the appearance, not only of a person. So this episode that you quoted, it's mostly about this, but also it is influenced with this, you know, long classical tradition, over 100 years long tradition of Ukrainian literature, speaking of our national problems in terms of Jewish history.
Thank you. Thank you very much for bringing that up. I think it'll be a surprise to most of our listeners or viewers to hear that Ukrainians have often used this analogy, have often thought of themselves as latter-day manifestations of the oppressed Jewish people that they read about in the Bible, etc. I also think it's a useful and productive analogy that can keep on giving. I'd like to invite Shalom to offer a few comments of his own about the similarities and differences between the Ukrainian people's historical struggle for liberty and independence and the Jewish people's.
I think that this comparison between the struggle for freedom of Ukrainians and biblical Exodus and Moses, it's quite an ancient theme. Actually, we can meet this theme along the centuries in many places. One of them, it's quite interesting and worth mentioning in the, I think, maybe the only primary source that most Jews or Israelis know about Jewish history in Ukraine, which is the Abyss of Despair, Yeven Metzula, which is the 17th century chronic of Rabbi Hanover about the Cossack rebellion. Now, when I say most Israelis know it, I mean that most Israelis and Jews know one quote, one specific quote of that chronicle, which describe very vividly the atrocities made to Jews. Hanover, of course, wasn't an eyewitness, but it's very kind of shockingly written. But very few read the whole thing, actually, and with the historical background, which is very good, actually. And one of the, I think, shocking things is that in the beginning, in the historical background, when he describes the reasons for that revolt, he almost quotes, almost word by word, the biblical description of the enslavement of the Jews in Egypt. And that's his description of the enslavement of Ukrainian peasants by the nobility. So I think for a Jewish reader of the 17th century, and this chronicle is quite hateful towards Cossacks and what we today call Ukrainians, you know, it's kind of in your face. Well, actually, yeah, they hate us and they kill us and we hate them as well, etc., etc. But in this story, says Hanover, they are the Jews and we are the Egyptians. Okay, and it's quite, I would say, really very powerful statements. And of course, you can meet it in many places. In literature.
Shalom, you have to say at least a few more words about why Jews are the Egyptians at that time for the benefit of our viewers.
Well, it's not me saying that, okay? But if we go to the narrative of Hanover in Yeven Metzula, basically what he's saying, and it's historically correct, that the main function of Jews is servants that work for the nobility, and the business of the nobility is exploiting the peasants, which in this area today we'd call them Ukrainians. So you have the nobility, and if we're talking about magnates, which the big landowners, they're mostly not even there. They don't do the dirty job themselves. So the Jews do it for them, and Jews do it for them because Jews are pushed to that position. That is their way of survival, because they were, I would say, expelled from the cities, the major cities in the king's territory, and thus many of them became actually under the control of the nobility. That was a law accepted in the Polish Sejm in the 30s of the 16th century. And that's what made actually Ukraine the most Jewish place on earth. In other places, they could be usually wealthy merchant in major cities. Ukraine was the almost only part of the world when you had the economic niche to sustain big numbers of Jews because of that colonization of the steppe, I would say. Okay, so I don't see Jews as the evil here, because in that, I would say, circumstances, almost nobody had choices. Okay, it is on the expense of somebody else, and Jews, like everybody else, did their best to kind of to take as much privileges as they could, which was partially successful. But yes, the thing is, and it's quite interesting, Hanover in Geber Metzula is really resentful and I would say hateful to Cossacks and Ukrainians, but he understands well why it's happening. And you understand that in that time, when you didn't have those idea of equality and racism is bad and things like that, in that time in which, as I said, hating each other is quite a part of the normality of life. He hates them because they are Jews, and so he understands why Ukrainians hate Jews, because Jews kind of hurting them. A few years ago, I had conversations with a smart man, originally from Western Ukraine, and actually it was quite a long time ago, and I was quite ignorant back then, even more than now. And he said that he's from Western Ukraine, and I said, well, but this is where all the nationalists, the stereotype that you mentioned. And he told me, this is the most liberal area in Ukraine. And I said, how could it be? They're the more nationalistic. This is the fact. And he told me, when you have, when you're a patriot, when you have your national identity, you can acknowledge and respect other national identities, even if you are in the state of hostility. And I can say that in my personal background, when I was working in the field of dialogue between Jews and Palestinians, I saw the same thing. The people that came that were kind of more militant and patriotic, they were the first to say, in the Jewish side, to say, why are you irritated of Palestinians being nationalistic? We're nationalistic too. We have identity, they have them, we have a flag, they have a flag. Yes, we were enemies, but this is normal. So one of the overlooked things in that common history is many, maybe quite small, but very interesting phases of cooperation and mutual understanding between Jews and Ukrainians. We can see it in, of course, in Poland between the wars in the party of the bloc of minorities. We can see it in different local elections in Galicia, where Jews, Ukrainians, mostly Zionist Jews actually, and Ukrainians ran together against more kind of Polish parties. We have a lot of very interesting interactions, but I think that the most important thing to understand is that the similarities is mostly because those two national movements actually emerged in the same place, time, and circumstances. Okay, again, in the late 19th century and early 20th, most of the world Jewry, especially before the big immigration to America, are in Eastern Europe and mostly in Ukraine. It means that even if Jews, Ukrainians, Poles, Russians, etc., have very different cultures, they respond to the same circumstances. Okay, so they ask themselves similar questions. Now, the answers that you give are coming, to some extent from your own particular culture, but you live in the same, I would say, cultural geography, and you breathe the same air, and you can't not notice what your neighbors are doing. Okay, in late 19th century or early 20th century Odessa, where Zionists were sitting and plotting, how do we start the Zionist movement? And they did it in some cafe in the Bogoslebsky street. In the next table, you had Ukrainians doing the same thing. In the table in the back, you had Greeks doing that, and Poles, and everybody was sitting in the same cafes, actually talking about the same subjects in the same time, in the same place. So I think that if I said that you cannot understand Jewish history without Ukrainian history, so you need to know that even Herzl was mentioned. Yeah, Herzl is very important, but there were very few Jews in Western Europe and Austria. And Herzl was the first to say that in order to the Zionist movement to exist, we need to reach out to the East European Jews. Actually, the East European Jews started that movement before Herzl, and one of the first decisions was to open 3 branches, one in Odessa, second in Warszawa, and the third one in, I don't remember, I think in Vienna or Berlin, Western Europe. This didn't happen, okay? Actually, you can say that Herzl was the third branch, to engage those more, I would say, wealthy Western Europeans. So you need to understand that Ukraine is the place of the masses of the Jews, the ones that Zionism, among other ideas, needed to convince. And you need to understand the circumstances and the political questions that were asked. And I think that to a big extent they're parallel. I think, I suspect, because there is not enough research, okay? It wasn't studied enough, but I suspect that the interactions and the mutual influence between those two groups was actually much deeper and wider than we tend to think. I cannot prove it right now because I don't think there is enough academic kind of study of that issue, but this is my suspicion, and I think if and when more researchers in the academy will take a new look on that subject, I think that's one of the things that we are about to find out.
Thank you, Shalom, for this. And I'll just follow up with a tiny example that I think will be new to most people viewing this, of this generosity that Shalom mentioned that one is able to have when one is secure in one's national identity. And that example is from the short-lived Ukrainian Republic that was set up at the end of World War I. And that republic at some point issued currency, their own currency. It was called karbovancy. And very interestingly, there is an example of a bill, of 100 karbovancy bill. And that bill had text in 4 languages: Ukrainian, Russian, Polish, and Yiddish. And that's an example of the intentions of that republic. We never got to see how that republic might have worked out, because the empires did not let it live. But that bill is itself a statement of liberality towards the non-Ukrainian elements of the nation that this republic intended to serve. And I think it's a very interesting historical example of that generosity you mentioned, Shalom. So moving on to another aspect of your writing, Oksana, this focus of this question is women, Ukrainian women. The common perception in Israel of women from Ukraine, as well as women from elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, because Israelis cannot generally tell them apart, is that they are somehow more feminine, more accepting of the traditional roles assigned to women in society, compared to women born in Israel, who seem to be farther along on the path to women's liberation. Much of your work, both literary and socio-political, has focused on women, on the treatment of women, and on women's struggles at personal and national liberation. And you have been a beacon of feminism in modern independent Ukraine and have inspired a generation of Ukrainian women. You wrote poignantly about the additional burden placed on women in this struggle and on the way the historical oppression of Ukraine was internalized by many Ukrainian men. In the book, Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex, you write about women, and I quote, "Our only choice, therefore, was and still remains between victim and executioner, between non-existence and an existence that kills you." What is your perspective on this struggle today, both in the field of Ukrainian literature and in the historic struggle happening in real life in Ukraine right now, where women are both the most vulnerable and taking an active part in the resistance to the invaders?
Well, you know, that's a very touchy subject. And again, I have to be interrupted somewhere in the middle, before, I plunge into lecturing into infinity on it. Because, yes, what has been a subject of my concern throughout my entire literary career has been, among other things, this gender aspect of colonialism and this women's prospect of subjugation, and how this being subaltern, actually, that explained, why Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex, that appeared in Ukraine in 1996, has become such a revolutionary book, because that was an attempt to translate these big national issues, which were not unusual for Ukrainian literature of the time, to translate them into the language of a female body. And that was something absolutely scandalous then, something totally unthinkable. And that was precisely the thing that made me a beacon of Ukrainian feminism, because the Ukrainian feminism was still young and looking for the voice and looking for the canonic text. Every movement needs a canonic text. Every movement needs its Bible. So this novel has been immediately claimed the Bible of the Ukrainian feminism. Now it is read, over a quarter of a century later. It is now read by the new generation as a book about more about toxic relationship, and toxic relationship can serve as a good metaphor for colonialism and for subjugation and for violence between states and nations as well. Well, but anyway, speaking, of this, of course, lots of things changed 25 years after. But literature is literature, not journalism. Literature always gets deeper. It works with the archetypes. It works with with the things that get perceived from different angles with the course of time. And yes, one generation after 25 years, it's classical generation, one generation, not 1.5. So 25 years after, well, it is still a book about liberation. It is still a book about women's determination. It now has its third edition in Poland, where the issue of women's liberation, concerning this anti-abortion laws and all this discourse around this, and the women's movement that is politically the most active force nowadays in Poland. This book now gets its third edition, and the book about women's freedom, so to speak. Freedom, just freedom, not liberation, but freedom. And freedom is a very, I would say, multi-leveled concept, so you really can read this multifaceted book, with different regards concerning women's issues. Yes, with colonialism, it's more or less clear, and but coming back, so with this colonial aspect of the gender discrimination, or rather the gender aspect of colonial discrimination, I mean, it works both ways. It's one thing. Another thing is where you started, and I see it again, as kind of colonial misperception, what you mentioned about this view of women coming from this former Soviet Union. There is no former Soviet Union, because even the Soviet Union was never homogeneous. And with this feminine women, or women looking feminine, this culture of women taught to look feminine. That's the problem, yeah. But I mean, with Ukrainian women, I would say it's a much more complicated tradition. After all, we are known as a country of strong women, and the country where women, and it's only understandable in every frontier culture, it's women who are responsible for the economy, while men go to the front to fight. The above-mentioned Cossacks, when they were going at war, they were leaving their ladies behind, because someone had to take care of the harvest. And providing, struggling for keeping things, for making things to move, and for providing the very texture of life remaining untouched. And that's what made Ukrainian women, on one hand, the proletariat of history, because history used to consist, prior to the advance of feminists, used to be read in terms of male deeds, of male story, of big things, big narrative belonging to men, and women are somewhere, behind, invisible. And yes, historically, Ukrainian women used to have privileges even as compared to the neighboring Western cultures, like the right to own property and not to share it with her husband, so on and so forth. I'm not going to dwell on that, but now what we see nowadays in the present day war, where women now in Ukraine, okay, they go to military service, they have, you know, their own hand in this, in the current war, where they can choose, you know, what to do, whether to work as volunteers, whether to do military service, or whether to take care of the families, and this looks very traditional. Yes, you know, women with children going abroad, or going or to the calm western part of the country, running from under the bombs to take care of the children and the elderly, while men go fighting. You know, there enters this issue of war rapes, and yes, that again, you know, brings us back to the atrocities of the previous wars, and this again proves that women become the most vulnerable part of the population in this very archaic war that Russia conducts. It's very archaic war. It's the war of the, I don't know, well, of the pre-modern period, actually. The way they conduct it, and this Ukrainian historians, you know, who now in the social media, they've already found the precedents in the Mongolian army, the tradition of raping children in front of their parents.
So it is not just politically that the Mongol Khan never left Moscow.
You see, I mean, that's some apology which again remain underexplored or totally unexplored, unmentioned. So we just have to change. We have to change our spectacles. We have to change optics.
I certainly hope so. And you've been very generous with your time. I'd just like to ask you one more question, a little more personally. In the book Fieldwork, there is a lot of, I think, a lot of anger and frustration with your fellow Ukrainians for their brokenness, for their insufficient dedication to proactive nation building and identity reclaiming after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And my question this time is, what made you different? Why have you emerged from the rubble of the Soviet Union with such dedication and determination? What is the fuel that has been driving you to be one of the prominent voices of this struggle all these years? Where does it come from?
There are more people like me now in Ukraine, especially in the new generation. And yes, back then in the 90s, we were kind of I would say, rather narrow strata of the cultural elite, because it had been a hard business for Ukrainian cultural elite to survive, you know, and to pass the tradition in time. That's been a separate story, and I still need that. That's the subject actually of the novel that started before last year, you know, and which remained in my computer back home in Kiev, and now I don't know. And well, now I'm looking forward to our victory and to the time when I'll be able to get back to this novel, because it's a very interesting issue. It's a very interesting subject. I love this tracing things that are invisible. that somehow must us, we know they are there, but we don't know because there are no instruments in our culture to recognize them. And the Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex is a kind of novel about how your past and how your collective traumas affect and in fact your everyday being without your noticing it, on the most elementary level, on the kitchen, in bed, in sex included. So that's something still interests me. The things, invisible big things, how they show themselves, big historical things, yes? How the history happens on this elementary level, how the history happens in private dimension, history happening in kitchen. So I am the product, I'm myself of this product of history happening in kitchen, of the family that was actually struggling for 2 generations just to preserve their identity, to survive both and intellectually and culturally. And so in a way, I am the product, it's only a half joke, but I am used to saying that I'm a product of a clandestine culture, so to speak, of the clandestine culture of the Ukrainian intelligentsia of the 20th century. And this might make an interesting story for this next novel, which I hope one day will be translated into Hebrew as well.
Oksana Zabushko, Shalom Boguslavsky, thank you very much for your time in this fascinating conversation. Once again, a warm thank you to Mishkanosha Ananim and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Israel for hosting this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.